The world comes to a child in the shape of stories. The child hears a story about what the world is like, and then the child goes on. So stories are just part and parcel of being human. Assalamu alaikum everyone, my name is Usman Malik. I am a rheumatologist and I'm a fiction writer, and I'm here at the invitation of my kind friends for MM Talks. So Midnight Always is a collection that I published last year. It's a collection of about 7 stories that were published over a decade of my creative work. I began writing in 2012 professionally. I began writing somewhere in 2013. That was when my first professional sale happened. And since then I've been published in various magazines all over the world, in the US, UK, Australia. I've been fortunate that the stories that I've written have been reprinted in several years' best collections, and my fiction has happily won a few awards. So my interest in reading obviously goes back to my childhood, as it is true for most writers. हम लोग जब बच्चे होते हैं, we are drawn by stories. I actually wrote an essay about this when Apex Magazine's editor Jason Sizemore asked me to write an essay on storytelling. And I thought about it and I said, the world comes to a child in the shape of stories. The child hears a story about what the world is like, and then the child goes on. So stories are just part and parcel of being human. So जब मैंने बचपन में कहानियाँ पढ़नी शुरू की, my mother used to read fairy tales to me, and those fairy tales were just very intriguing. And so my interest kept developing, and मैं शुरू में उर्दू में पढ़ता रहा, उमरू यार चंचंगलू, हम उमरू यार कहते थे, it's actually अमर यार. And हम बच्चों की दुनिया, बच्चों का बाग, तलिस्म होशरुबा, चलूसक मलूसक, you name it, मैंने सब पढ़ा था. और मैं mostly उर्दू में पढ़ता रहा till I was almost in about, I don't know, grade 7, grade 8. I think I got bored of Urdu stories. I didn't find them creative anymore, to be honest, at least not at the kid level. And then I started switching to English for more interesting subjects. There was more variety. और फिर उसके बाद सफ़र चलता गया, पढ़ते गए, और हाई स्कूल का ज़माना आ गया, कॉलेज का ज़माना आ गया. I ended up going to Aga Khan. I became a physician. Then I moved to the US. मैंने वहाँ पे मेडिसिन में रेजिडेंसी की, and 2012 तक मैं कहानी, किताबें सब कुछ भूल गया. I was just doing medicine. Then in 2012 I came back to literature and fiction writing, and I started submitting stories, and over the course of a year or so, I slowly began selling stories, and then the stories started being read by people. There were editors and critics and other science fiction writers and readers who enjoyed some of them. और फिर वहाँ से एक किस्सा चल पड़ा. And that day and today, I'm in the field. People often ask me about the genre of my stories, and I often say, I've never thought about genre as a stories, but it's a mix really. I think the genre I would say I'm most comfortable with is probably, I would say, uncanny fiction or ghost stories, maybe some fantasy. But I have, my stories interplay with history, myth, psychology. I have a lot of interest in interiority, human interiority, and I sort of use that to tell my stories. I teach classes on haunted houses and how they operate, how the psychodynamics of a haunted house work. And I often say the outer always reflects the inner. So every time we write a story about a haunted house, it's actually the person who's haunted, not the house. And so that kind of gives you a little flavor of what I like doing in terms of my fiction and my literature. And these days I practice rheumatology in Lahore. I lived in the US till 2019, and then I moved here. Why rheumatology as my specialty of practice? And I often think of, we talk about specialties, but really it's a mode of thinking. Why this mode of creative or medical expression? I was a hospitalist in Florida for almost 5 years, and then I decided to go and subspecialize at University of Florida. Probably the reason was I just found it a very interesting cognitive field. Or while today is not really supposed to be about my medical, I think, aspect of things, but I think it's interesting because I operate at the intersection of art and medicine anyways. And so I often teach medical students, disease happens at the interface of the environment and the individual. And it's your immune system, as we saw in the era of pandemics and COVID, that it is at the interface of the immune system and the environment that most pathology and disease happens. So rheumatology is where the crux of medicine lies. In fact, my mentor, Dr. Reeves at the University of Florida, who's a world-renowned immunologist, used to say that all of medicine is immunology, including heart disease or infections, as COVID, as we saw, and many, many other problems. So rheumatology is something that excites me. It's highly underserved. And this is probably a good time to actually note that Pakistan has a population of 225 million people. We have only 60 to 70 certified rheumatologists in the entire country. That gives you a ratio of almost 70 lakh to one provider. So it's a horribly underserved specialty. Obviously, we're in a big city, but you move outside big cities and suddenly you see people driving 8 hours. There are people who actually rent a car, poor people in the mountains who rent a car or from southern Punjab, and they pay 10,000 rupees just to get to the city to see a rheumatologist every time. So think of how much money is being expended that should not be expended that way and maybe should go towards their treatment. So it is a specialty that at some point we'll talk about more, I'm sure, in terms of education. I have written articles for Dawn on rheumatoid problems. So I would urge you to look up some of those articles. You can Google Usman T Malik, dawn.com, and you'll get 5 or 6 articles. So in terms of Midnight Doorways, मैंने पहले काफ़ी देर पकड़ के रखी. Midnight Doorways, like I said, it's a collection of 7 stories. They are really cross-genre, although that term's now falling out of favor because literature is literature. So, but these are stories, 7 stories, इनमें ghost stories हैं, इनमें fantasy, इनमें science fiction है, इनमें weird fiction है, इनमें horror है. The common thread through them would be that a lot of these stories are dark stories. It's really dark fiction. Pakistan, I actually once gave a talk on this, that Pakistan is a very dystopian country, When you're in Pakistan, you don't need to write dystopias. You're already living a dystopian reality. You have been living it for a long, long time. So if you write realist literature in Pakistan, literature based on daily life, it's going to be horrific because you're living horrific realities at every stratum of society. So Midnight Doorways ki jo kahani hai, they are about people who have lost things. It's a book about loss in many, many ways. And people who then gain certain things through that loss. जब हमने बुक का सोचा तो फिर I approached Musharraf Ali Farooqi, a friend of mine. We were just talking about it at LLF actually. And Musharraf said, well, it's been a long time coming. We should put a book together. And then I spoke with Amir Hussain Saab, another friend of mine, a very well-known short story writer. And Amir said, yeah, it's a pretty, tumhara ho gaya time. So we put this book together as a hybrid project. And we said, well, if we're going to do this, let's do something interesting that's never been done before. So what we decided on was we ended up doing sort of an illuminated manuscript. So every story in this book had separate art commissioned by a local Pakistani artist. Because I already had some readership in the West, so I wanted to showcase Pakistani speculative art, Pakistani science fiction art, as well as my own stuff. So this is really a collectible in that way. A total of 9 visual artists were involved in the production of this book. Cover alada, design alada, her story ki art alada. And so the cover art by Rohama Malik, who is a well-known artist, that happily was showcased in the US at several occasions. The book is available in several American libraries now. Just a month ago, not even a month, maybe 3 weeks ago, the book won the Crawford Award, which is one of the largest fantasy awards in the world. It's given out by the International Association for the Fantastic and Arts, who give out the award every year in Orlando, Florida. And so we got really lucky, we were really fortunate, and the book became only the 2nd book ever published outside an Anglophone country to win that award. Before that, it was Zen Cho's Spirits Abroad that was published in Malaysia. Before that, every award for 40 years was given only to books published in Anglophone countries. So we have, alhamdulillah, that honor. And as this is the first time a Muslim won the award. So this question often comes up about science fiction or science fiction kya hoti hai, science fiction in regional context. While I don't necessarily consider myself a science fiction writer because I think it's a very hard genre to write well in. आप किसी भी genre में कुछ भी लिख सकते हैं, but it doesn't necessarily make it something interesting or important that will have relevance to a particular region or cultural context. But science fiction is a very interesting genre, and I almost always want to talk about it a little bit One of my favorite definitions of science fiction is by the great writer Ted Chiang, who once said to this question, what science fiction is about, he said, it's the genre in which you have thought experiments, but what you're doing is, science fiction pushes at the boundaries of knowledge and expands them. So it's a literature of knowledge and ideas, as often a lot of people say. Historically, we used to say it's the literature of wonder tales, and maybe that is still true. In the Pakistani context, in 2015, I wrote an essay called Rockets, Robots, and Reckless Imagination. It was published in Dawn Herald magazine. And it was a big detailed article in which we discussed the importance and pertinence of science fiction to Pakistan and countries like Pakistan, the global south. कि ये इतनी important क्यों है? And the idea was that science fiction is literature that forces people to fill other people's shoes. You're imagining alternate realities, you're imagining future Pakistan, you're writing future fiction. And that is such a critical thing for Pakistanis to do, because we are, as a lot of people know, Pakistan is really vulnerable to climate change as a country. Hamare coastal areas, Karachi, Lahore, Lahore is already enveloped by the worst climate change you can think about, smog. A normal AQI in Florida is 20, in Lahore it hits 800. So this is a real mortal threat. So we need to think about utilizing the tools that science fiction provides to tackle these challenges. And this is a conversation that is happening in various colleges, campuses, and institutions in Pakistan. So that is how I do always want to talk a little bit about science fiction and climate change and the threat of it, and something called eco-fiction or eco-fiction, which is becoming a big thing in the West. I think we're getting probably close to the end of our conversation, or rather talk. In conclusion, I would say we are living in very exciting times in terms of both literary and artistic innovation in the global South regions. Some of the most interesting stuff that is coming out from these regions is cross-genre stuff that doesn't stick clearly to one mode of literary expression. We don't think of realism as the only respectable genre anymore. Irrealism, as it is often called, is a very interesting and respectable mode, and I hope more people explore that genre. And if you want to start, I think this is a reasonable start.